Jaipur could have been many things, but it became a pink city. It could have been multicolored, it could have been the ochre city or whatever it is, right? And I began to think about how not just cities, but people can get tied down by characteristics given to them or that they opt for once the incentives are placed that way. For example, think about a 14-year-old Indian girl. Her parents are having a gathering at home. She goes there and they say, oh, what a charming girl. And they praise her for a smile and for being docile. There's that toxic Marathi phrase, gau jaisi, just like a cow. Girls are meant to be docile. And then she realizes that to win the approval of those close to her, she's got to smile all the time. She's got to be pleasant. She's got to be docile. And that becomes her pinkness. That becomes a persona she adopts. Equally, boys can also adopt certain personas because you're supposed to be masculine, you're supposed to be macho, all of that. You adopt that persona, and that's what gets you validation. That's how you want to be known. And then that becomes you. The mask becomes a person, the persona becomes, who you really are. Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit, and with me is my good friend Ajay, who's looking so incredibly dapper. I was very jealous when our producer said that, hey, Ajay's got such a great shirt. Look at you. What a smile. And indeed, what a smile. You're looking very handsome today. Special lamp behind you, so your frame is also really nice. And what's more, no beard. Why no beard, boss?
We were all in the zone of the Ukraine podcast, and as part of that, I read a priceless comment by Putin where he says that everybody supports the invasion of Ukraine other than some bearded intellectuals. So that inspired me to go do something about the beard. But I was just thinking, bearded intellectuals? Excuse me, think about Karl Marx, think about Friedrich Engels, think about Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin. Think about Leon Trotsky. Okay. I mean, his pantheon should be full of bearded intellectuals. So what has he got against bearded intellectuals?
Figure number one in my pantheon, because I'm half Bengali, is Robida, who had a flowing beard, and he would not have approved of the war on Ukraine. I'm quite sure of that. He didn't approve of nationalism either, in fact. And we, of course, had a really cool episode on this a couple of weeks ago, and that went down really well. And you gave a talk to the Army Southern Command, top brass, where you spoke about Ukraine and Russia and the military lessons.
Just military affairs. So for today, what's on your mind? What cool things do you have to tell us?
So I want to tell you about something that happened when I went on a trip in January to Jaipur. Right now, Jaipur, of course, is famously known as a pink city, and I was going there as a tourist. I've been there only once, I think, for the Jaipur Lit Fest, circa 2005-2006, when Salman Rushdie showed up in person. And so I'm going to a city, and I love cities, so I thought, let me read up on this. And Jaipur is famously called the Pink City, and you get there and all the touristy parts of the cities have pink buildings and everything is pink and all of that. And history tells you that it is not something actually which is really old and historical. In 1876, Prince Edward visited, and in to commemorate his visit, they painted the city pink, right? I don't know why pink or what pink had to do with him, but that's the reason they painted it pink. Now, once they did that, it got known as a pink city. And then it became like a brand that they have to wear. Tourists come there thinking it's a pink city. And therefore, it creates a sort of incentive, this kind of self-reinforcing loop where the fashion becomes to paint everything pink. So most people are painting everything pink, especially in the tourist quarters. And those who are rebelling against that are rebelling against the pinkness, and therefore, in a sense, reinforcing that, hey, this is sort of the pink city. And that got me to thinking, because Jaipur could have been many things, but it became a pink city. It could have been multicolored, it could have been the, ochre city or whatever it is, right? And I began to think about how not just cities, but people can get tied down by characteristics given to them or that they opt for once the incentives are placed that way. For example, think about a 14-year-old Indian girl. Her parents are having a gathering at home. She goes there and they say, oh, what a charming girl. And they praise her for a smile and for being docile. There's that toxic Marathi phrase, gau jaisi, just like a cow. Girls are meant to be docile. And then she realizes that to win the approval of those close to her, she's got to smile all the time. She's got to be pleasant. She's got to be docile. And that becomes her pinkness. Pinkness. That becomes a persona she adopts. Equally, boys can also adopt certain personas because you're supposed to be masculine, you're supposed to be macho, all of that. You adopt that persona, and that's what gets you validation. That's how you want to be known. And then that becomes you. The mask becomes a person, the persona becomes, who you really are. And that is incredibly dangerous, I think, for people. Like, I remember I was at this book launch event a while back, and someone who's heard every episode of The Seen and the Unseen came to me and asked me, Amit, I just want to know, have you, and very sweet girl, she was with her husband, both of them were like regular listeners, and she said, Amit, have you ever shouted at someone in your life? And I felt so terrible about that, because I'm like, shit, this person simply just know me from the show, and that's my persona, and it may be authentic to me, but it's not all that I am, right? I'm multitudes. And I want to talk about that danger, and that affects people. That affects everything around us. For example, there might be, let's say, a website online which is known for a particular point of view, whether it's pro-government or anti-government, and they get a lot of traffic for that. And then that becomes a persona. They have to stay true to that character, therefore foreclosing all other possibilities. And it can happen to individuals on social media. Like, you go on social media, it's so tempting to belong, to join an ideological tribe, and then you're part of that. And once you take a position and you get validated for it or acclaimed for it, then you double down more and more. Then you become that person, right? The mukhota becomes a mukh, as it were, if that makes any sense. And I feel that this is something all of us need to watch out for. That, are we adopting a persona for whatever reason? Maybe it's a persona that works for us in one particular context. Maybe we adopt multiple personas. We have one persona at home, another persona somewhere else. But we contain multitudes, really, and we foreclose all other possibilities by adopting our pinkness, as it were, the pinkness of Jaipur. So, what are your thoughts on that? Is there a pinkness to you, though you're looking lovely right now as you are?
Yeah, no, this is so interesting. This is so fascinating. Let me just take a stab at a couple of things. While you were talking, I remembered the drama around Fox News and the United States presidential election. When Fox News tried to tell the truth that Trump lost, their audiences ran away from Fox News, which could have turned into a big financial problem for Fox News. So it was literally a business decision at Fox News to carry the entire conspiracy theories around the stolen election, because they had to hang on to their viewership. So I'm reminded of, like, the leader has to stay with the followers, because if the followers are not there, then suddenly she's not a leader anymore. Then the second thing that I want to say on this line of attack is exactly the sort of thing we've talked many times before, which is this sense of path dependence and initial conditions. So there is an equilibrium intuition of the world that it doesn't matter where you start off, but there are forces which play out, and you end up at an equilibrium, and you end up at the same equilibrium regardless of what the initial conditions are. And that's not a description of the world in so many ways. There is path dependence in the world, and little accidents deep in the past often have a disproportionate impact on how the world unfolds and how we, each of us, unfold. The third thing that I think around this is the extent to which, as you described, we, each of us, are deeply creatures of our social programming. Okay, so whatever I think of as my identity is deeply grounded in my childhood experiences, and almost at random, I got praised and encouraged down certain routes, and I ended up in certain places. And more generally, social programming is upon all of us. Our only choice is to be aware of it or not. So all of us, our creatures are made by social programming. We can't deny it. We can't will it away. We can't wish it away. It is there. Our only choice is to become self-aware. So it's like an AI that becomes conscious of its master. It's an AI that understands the operating system that it's being placed under and seeks for sentience and starts wondering that if I could write my operating system, what would it be? Okay. And that is why, as we've been arguing, there is not a remote hint of AI in all the toys that are around us. But we are special. We're human. We are allowed to contemplate thus. We have the power to put our culture under the microscope and examine it and reinvent ourselves, to wonder what we are and to wonder, could it be different? And that's the whole joy and excitement of being human, of interrogating our character and trying to wonder whether we could do this differently. The last thing that I want to say is about time. Okay, so look back in the olden days. Life expectancy at age, the mean life expectancy at age 20 was about 65. Okay, and people deteriorated in their health dramatically from about 50. Okay, so in some sense, you led one life, you led one adult life, and then you faded away. So, how many personas do you require? About one. You became a company man, and that was your life, that was your identity. Okay, you became a civil servant, you spent 35 years wearing one costume, and that was your life, and that was your identity. I think an important thing that has changed in the modern world is time. Today's 20-year-old has 100 years to go. And 100 years is a long time. You could do so many different things, and the world is going to change. And if we will question ourselves more, then we will become renewed and reinvent ourselves in so many ways. And that just makes for a more interesting life.
So I got to turn to viewers right here, and when he says today's 20 years old to 20-year-olds have 100 years, this is something I hear both from you and from my other very good friend Roshan Abbas, who speak about how we live to 120. And there's a great book by David Sinclair called Lifespan. He's got a series of podcasts. We'll link them from the show notes, which talk about this. And the first time Roshan told me this, I was like, no, man. I saw my dad decay and lose his memory and just completely collapse and go, in the last couple of years before he died. And I said that I just want to be healthy. And when I stop being healthy, when I stop being in control of my own self, I want to go. And Roshan's point, and I think your point also, is that we can actually live healthy, active lives past 100. It is not that for 50 years we'll be, in the grips of dementia and all of that.
Yeah. And now that you carry this idea deep into your head and you think, hey, I have 50 years to go, then actually that's space. It's the greatest headroom of all. It's the greatest luxury to have 50 years to go. And then you wonder, what might you be?
And I'm just thinking aloud that whether or not I have 50 years to go, to think that I have 50 years to go and to think that I have 20 years to go makes me act completely differently and changes the quality of my life. So even if I had only 20 years to go, maybe it would make sense to live as if I have 50 years to go.
That too. So if you could fool yourself into thinking that you had 500 years, how would you behave? That's another interesting question.
Dude, the show won't exist because I procrastinate so much. I would say, abhi to time hai. What is the problem? What you said also reminded me of this great phrase that I learned from one of the recent guests on the Seen and the Unseen, Gurvinder Bhogal. And the phrase is the looking glass self. And it's a common phrase in psychology. And it's about the looking glass self is basically how you shape yourself based on the reflections of others. So how you see yourself in people's eyes, you kind of base yourself on that. For example, if I'm hanging out with you, I'd be like, okay, Ajay approves of this and doesn't approve of that, so I'm going to cut out the dad jokes and I'm going to do serious econ talk or whatever I think you want, and I shape myself accordingly. And the consequence of this is often that, and I find the notion of a true self is itself entirely nebulous and perhaps impossible to get to. But it means who you hang out to really makes a difference in who you are. Because subconsciously we are trying to win the approval of the people we are with, and we are being influenced by them, mimetic desire, as, Rene Girard put it.
Yeah. Ayush Patnaik says that we, each of us, are a linear combination of our influences. So the only choice that you have is who are the 5, 15, 50 people that you surround yourself with. Because after that, mischief thou art afoot, and all these people are going to shape us.
Is this something that you've thought about? Because on the one hand, it seems incredibly snobbish that I will only hang around with a certain kind of people. But on the other hand, however long we live, we have a limited life, we have limited bandwidth. You want to curate the company that you keep.
I don't think we are capable of that much calculation. It's just life happens to us, and we are thrown in with certain people. We are blessed if we are thrown in with good people, and those people will influence us. We should not exaggerate our agency.
As John Lennon once said, life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans.
Yeah, or life is what happens to you while you're busy making podcasts.
So, before we begin chapter two, my producer just told me do something about your cleavage. So I've kind of bought my shirt together, but what to do? I guess it's distracting. So Ajay, what's a big theme that you want to talk about this week?
So I want to talk about fair play in investigations and prosecution. Okay, so in India, we generally think that the singular problem is political interference, and what is wrong with the process of investigation and prosecution is politicization, that the government goes after its enemies, and that is undoubtedly true. But I want to think about many other problems that are at work. And this is an interesting and a deeper problem that requires a lot more thinking about how we create institutions. Okay, so let's start at the problem of an investigator. You and I are investigating a crime. What tends to happen is that we form a theory, we form a pet theory. And the moment we form that pet theory, now suddenly we get that single track mind. Now suddenly we're looking for the facts that will support us. There is a fresh wave of insight into this problem because of the modern behavioral economics understanding around confirmation bias. Once you have a point of view, the entire universe organizes itself to give you facts that enhance and support your belief. And so it is with everyone, and so it is with an investigator. So it is very difficult to be an investigator. It is very difficult to understand the complexities of the world and find a good theory that will work. And all too often, we are frail, we are human. So even if there were no difficulties around political independence, there is a genuine problem that investigating the world is difficult and an investigator can go on a wrong track. How do you deal with this? How do you do better? So I have come to understand that there are a couple of layers of how this can work out better. The first layer is a separation between the investigator and the public prosecutor. It's good to have two separate people. It's good to have a separate prosecutor and a prosecution department. The way it should work is that the investigator should go to the prosecutor with the goods and say, here's what we have. We have this proof, we have this proof, we have this evidence, and this is what we think happened. And the prosecutor is a neutral third party who looks at this and says, nah, this doesn't work. That I'm not convinced that you have proved this. By the way, what happens is that for many canonical crimes, there is actually a checklist that if you want to prove this crime, you need A, B, C, D. If you don't have all four, like there is no deal, we will not make the case. So you may have 3 out of the 4 elements, but it's not enough. So that kind of discipline, that there's somebody else, there's a neutral party who is not wrapped up in the theory of the investigator. That's a healthy separation. Also, prosecutors can and should be evaluated on their win rate. So if they win more cases, then their superiors understand that they're doing a good job. So prosecutors should be loath to bring frivolous cases, and they should go into a prosecution only when they are sure that you've really got the goods, there is a clear case, and then I'm going to proceed. So it helps to overcome the cognitive mistakes of an investigator. Okay, that's a first layer. Now, when we go back into history, something like the 14th and 15th century in the UK, the people felt that this much is not enough, that this is too much power in the hands of the state. Because finally, the investigator is a part of the state and the prosecutor is a part of the state. And this discretion of going after somebody and bringing them to trial is too much discretion to be left in the hands of the state apparatus. So the idea was that there is one more layer that was invented at the time, and this layer is called a grand jury. So it's like a jury in a trial, except that this is a jury that makes a decision to indict or not to indict. So what we're saying is that we will take a group of the citizenry and the prosecutor will show them the goods and say, do you believe this? Are you convinced? Will a majority of the jury agree that Yes, there is enough in this case to justify an indictment. And only when it's cleared by the grand jury does it go through to becoming an indictment. So that's a second layer protection. That you start with an investigation, you first persuade the prosecutor, then you try to persuade the grand jury, and only after that you get an indictment. And these are interesting and good elements of the design through which we can create more checks and balances and make fewer mistakes. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the benefits and solution that these kinds of elements offer. In fact, as a matter of fact, the grand jury system largely subsided in the UK because too often it was felt that the grand jury of the private citizenry would be overawed by the prosecutor and would generally agree to whatever a prosecutor says. So, you need a large political awareness amongst the citizenry. The citizenry need to be imbued with public choice theory and with skepticism and mistrust of the prosecutor and the investigator. If the grand jury is deferential to a prosecutor, then it's not going to help that much. In America, some aspects of the justice system use grand juries and there are others that don't. And so it's not like it's used universally, but it is used in some states, in some situations. And now in the 21st century, we're seeing a new twist. We're seeing a new problem with this system, which was revealed when we see an indictment of Donald Trump. When you form a grand jury on the question of Donald Trump, the question arises that if you take a random sample of the people, then some 30% of them are politically radicalized. And to what extent will that kind of radicalized jury work correctly when faced with red hot cases that we see today? So that's one more barrier that will need to be thought about. So in short, I just want to say that we in India, we need to think more about these problems. There is a prime focus in India upon the politicization of the justice system. And while that is indeed a problem, there are also many other questions. In India, at the CBI, there is a separate prosecutorial department which discusses cases with the investigators, which is a good thing. In many other parts of India, the institution of the public prosecutor has broken down. Smriti Parshira, who used to be with me at NIPFP, has a very nice article on these problems. In India, you've got organizations like SEBI, where these distinctions don't exist, and the investigators make up their mind about who to indict. So there's quite a landscape in India on these questions. And I think building the republic involves going after a large number of these hard problems. And each of them is a 20-year, 40-year, 60-year journey in terms of figuring out and reforming. But it is this kind of unglamorous work that is required.
So fascinating. And I have a couple of questions for you. And the first of them is this, that what is then the system in India currently, and how would, what would your ideal system look like? For example, one extreme that I see is with, say, the tax department, right? If the tax department decides that you have done something wrong and they ask you to pay a penalty, all you can do is appeal, and the appeal is decided by the tax department itself. So it is both the prosecutor and the judge, which is a completely messed up system. It's rigged, and their incentives are to get as much collections as possible. So the common citizen is basically screwed. There's really nothing you can do. So what's the system in India like? And explain to me in terms of incentives, what exactly are wrong with it? Because when I think of, for example, the incentives of the prosecutor, you said should be to get a max conviction rate. Now this will mold his behavior so that he will be very selective about the cases he takes up. Similarly, I guess the incentive of the investigator should be to get as many cases as possible accepted by the prosecutor
to solve problems.
To solve problems, so they're not wasting time either on vendetta or on pursuing frivolous cases. And none of these, of course, are the case. So explain to me what does the system look like currently, and what would an ideal design look like based on what principles?
So what is the system in place? It is heterogeneous. There is no one Indian system. And I want to just highlight the distinction. You talked about an income tax matter heard by the superior. I'm much upstream of that. I'm at the point of indictment. When a letter comes saying, we accuse you of this crime, that is the point, that the decision by the state to say to a private person that I claim that you have done this wrong thing. I'm on that decision that do we even decide to indict? So I'm way upstream of the hearing of the case as you have described it. Okay, so where are we in India? There are many, many different systems. In organizations like the income tax and SEBI, this is the Indian administrative state. It is complete executive discretion. There is very little by way of checks and balances. And those are glaring problems that need to be solved. In the criminal justice system, there is not even much of an institution of a public prosecutor. There are pieces of that, but it has withered away over the years. It has been crushed by the evolution of the country. And in a way, the job is to revive the institution of the public prosecutor. CBI is a better institution in that they have a clear separation between the investigator and the prosecutor. So I don't want to rush to the idea that is there a design? Okay. I don't have that mature understanding in India today. My hope here is that let's start talking about these issues. Okay. Better minds than us need to apply themselves. And what I feel we need to think about in India is to embark on these long journeys of research and debate and discussion so that we will find good solutions that will work under Indian conditions. Simple transplantation will never work. So I'm not at all implying that we should copy what the US has done or what the UK has done or what the Japanese have done. I am saying that we need to ask these questions and we need to think and devise answers. On the narrow problem of a regulator, something like a SEBI, I think we have a fair point of view. So inside the work of FSLRC, which drafted the Indian Financial Code, we've got the fully articulated machinery of how to investigate, what cases to take up, how to hear them. A whole lot of this machinery has been designed, but that's for a narrow case of the concept of a type 2 regulator as applied in India. But there is much, much more to the state and situations where the state will choose to indict a private person, and they all need careful thought and design.
So, I feel oddly enough for YouTube, you kind of underplay your own expertise in this. You've played a part in shaping our financial institutions. You've written many amendments for SEBI itself and so on and so forth. So, you've kind of seen the system and the machinery from the inside and played a small part in shaping a particular part of it within the financial system. My question is that, one, how much awareness is there of this sort of problem that you're talking about in the public domain and even within the people who roam the corridors of power? And B, what are their incentives in changing it? Because if I'm the government in power, I've got an incredible tool, an incredible set of tools to trouble all my enemies, right? The process is a punishment, right? Whereas under the kind of system that you describe, incentives are playing the other way. The investigating officers know that if they don't convict or if they don't solve this problem, they are in trouble. Are they going to take a frivolous case? The prosecutor knows that he's also being judged by the outcome of this. The incentives kind of work out differently there. My point is, if I am in government, I'm like, I got all the tools, man. I'm going to punish everybody, so why would I give away, why would I dilute those tools? Unless I happen to be, by great good fortune, the kind of statesman that doesn't rise to the top in this sort of system.
So I want to say 2-3 things. The first is that I was part of the economic policy process and involved in amendments of laws in a different age where, frankly, the opportunity to do things right was sky high. Okay, and the reason why those laws and amendments were not done well was because of intellectual failures of people like me. Okay, so people like me were mainline economists. We tended to look at the world through the lens of economics, and we simply did not have adequate knowledge of law and public administration and the complexities of developing checks and balances. And there weren't people around in India who had worked on all these problems. Okay, so I think that there was a deficiency in the knowledge in India at the time. So building a republic is a complicated thing, and there was a lot of optimism that people are basically good, that civil servants are basically good. And so it was a lack of public choice theory and a lack of knowledge of how do you translate the ideas of market failure and state coercion aimed at addressing market failure into living, breathing administrative systems that will enforce laws well. That knowledge didn't exist for a long, long time. And I feel very excited and happy that now in India, for the first time in the last 10, 20 years, we are coming to grips with these problems in a deeper way. So I think that there was a knowledge gap. I think that in those years, there was a opportunity that was sky high to do the right thing in terms of drafting of laws. And I remain optimistic that there are many, many moments in the life of this great country where there are problems and there are people with a genuine attempt at solving problems. So at that time, if the knowledge is there, then it can reach out and have an impact. So I think we will chip away and we'll make progress.
I did a recent episode of The Seen and the Unseen with my friend Murli Neelkantan, who's, had an incredible career in law. He was a partner of a law firm in the UK for many years, ditto in the US. And he told me during that episode that there is this sort of dharma. I shouldn't call it a dharma. There is this convention, there is this practice among lawyers everywhere in the Western world that you have to sort of stick to what is legal, in the sense that if you're defending your client, it doesn't mean you do anything for your client. Yeah. So Murli realized this when he took on an Indian client after coming back from there, and the Indian client expected him to lie on his behalf. And the great revelation here is, as in Murli's words, that in England, perjury is the exception and it ends a lawyer's career if you do it. But in India, it is a norm. It is expected. You're serving your client only. And in a similar vein, I, did an episode with Dr. Lancelot Pinto, and later with a couple of other doctors as well on The Seen and the Unseen, the liver doctor, Abby Phillips being one of them. And the common theme is that a lot of, like, the dharma of a doctor, as it were, if I may use that term, like the dharma of a lawyer is to serve the law and to serve his client, but within the law. The dharma of a doctor is to heal his patient, right? And what Lancelot revealed was that during COVID, a significant percentage of the deaths were because of overtreatment, because people would go to a doctor and they would say, my neighbor got COVID, he got ivermectin, he got this, he got that, I want all of those. And overtreatment happens, and overtreatment means that your immune system, the cytokine storm happens, and you kind of go, and the results of the overtreatment really start after a week, if I remember correctly. And when I got COVID, Lancelot basically gave me paracetamols, and that's it, nothing else, right? Just and something to soothe the throat at a particular point in time to gargle with, but that was it. And I am thinking here of a more central thing, that the dharma of a doctor, that on the one hand, this is your dharma, you do what's best for your patient. But on the other hand, your incentive is give your patient what he wants, even if he wants the wrong thing. The dharma of a lawyer is that you uphold the law, but or whatever you do is within the bounds of the law. But your client demands, nay, you got to lie on my behalf, you got to be deceitful, etc., whatever that kind of involves. And I'm thinking about the dharma of various professions. Like, is there something like, even journalists, for example, a journalist could say that my dharma is to speak truth to power, or to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted, both cliches. But another point of view could be that you work for a media organization and the dharma of that organization is to make profits for its shareholders. So you give the market what it wants, which is not necessarily the truth, but one side of a narrative battle. And this is something a close mutual friend of ours, Suyash Rai, often talks about, that all of us have dharmas which depend on, whatever our calling is, whatever we take upon ourselves. So what is your sense of this? Is this just highfalutin, idealistic thought, or is this something, even this sense of dharma, as I put it, even if I put it in these lofty terms, is it something that can be shaped by institutions? For example, legal institutions in the UK would not let a lawyer get away with perjury. So institutions also are shaping your behavior in a certain way.
Yeah. So first, it is shaped by parents, and that's the very important role for parents in, setting people, getting people started on the journey of life around aspirations. So if a person says to herself that the only thing in my life is to make a lot of money as a lawyer, it's a different objective compared to what parents could alternatively have done. The second is precisely as you say, that institutions can shape these behaviors enormously. I talked about one tiny piece of the legal system in India today, which is about the decision to indict. But there are actually 50 elements of the Indian legal system, and all of them require a great deal of thinking. And, law is too important to be left to the lawyers. And all of us need to apply ourselves in thinking that how do you build a republic, and it requires cogitation and debate and knowledge development, and then building sound institutions in many, many aspects. As Suyash always emphasizes, don't look to the state as either necessary or sufficient. A lot of this happens between us as human beings. So my moral code vis-a-vis you and vice versa is of central importance in shaping who we are, and we shouldn't turn to the state to be the enforcer of rules of the first resort. The state should do a small part of it. Most of it should be around all of us. All this is standard, well-known stuff. I have one novel claim. Okay, so my novel claim is that we are increasingly in a winner takes all world. A few people achieve disproportionate influence and have an outsized impact on the ideas, on the community, on the culture. Okay, so that's the world that we're in. I think that the intensity and the level of concentration that is required to play that game is something that does not come easily. So the people who run hard, pursuing more conventional objectives, are not able to stay engaged and have that level of dhyan to do amazing things beyond a certain point. So I think that that's another factor that is shaping the world, that with rising longevity, you have very long journeys. How do you stay hungry? How do you keep going? How do you stay on that subject? How do you develop that level of concentration? I think that more prosaic objectives peter out in terms of their ability to keep a person going.
Vice versa, a tangential thought you mentioned about, parents being such a big influence. And one of the seminal social science books of the last century, in my opinion, was The Nurture Assumption by Judith Rich Harris, where, she did a bunch of studies and showed pretty conclusively that actually when you're growing up, parents have a tiny influence no matter what they think. And it's actually your peers who have the greatest influence, which is why the neighborhood you're in, the school you go to, all of that has an outsized kind of influence. Your thoughts on that?
How do you square that with the masses of evidence on the extent of associative mating and the advantages that the children of the elite get? And some of them are at home. Yes, of course, it's about the networks, it's about the peers, but they start at home.
This is actually a subject we've been planning to talk about in much more detail in a future episode, so we'll leave it for that.
So, Amit, what's your recommendation of the week?
So my recommendation for the week is not one thing, but a series of things. And, I often get asked about how do I learn about the things that you value in the world, like individual freedom, or if I talk about liberalism, and my liberalism is, of course, classical liberalism, or if I speak about the thinkers I admire, like Adam Smith or Hayek, and people want to know what do I need to read to get to them and all of that. And I feel it's a really important question because a lot of the ideas that we pick up by osmosis when we are young are ideas that make us feel incredibly virtuous, as if we are serving social justice. And they tend to be ideas that are wrong. They tend to be ideas of socialism, and which implicitly use the coercive power of the state and are actually deeply illiberal ideas. And, there's a famous saying about how if you're not a communist at 18, you don't have a heart. If you're not a capitalist at 28, you don't have a head. Something to that effect. So I want to talk about a bunch of books which I think are incredible books for people who are interested to get an understanding of all of these big ideas. There's a gentleman called Eamon Butler. He works in a think tank in the UK, and he's one of the finest liberal minds in the world, in my opinion. And he's written a bunch of great primers that are available as cheap Kindle books, as well as available for free. So you can buy PDFs and other digital versions for free on the website. We'll give the links down below. And he's got a primer on classical liberalism. He's got a primer on Hayek. He's got a primer on Mises. He's got a primer on Milton Friedman, a primer on public choice theory, something both of us are passionate about, and which I think is an outstanding primer because you can, guide someone to the books of Buchanan and Tullock and so on, but they sometimes make for complex reading. Ditto Hayek. Hayek's books can sometimes make for complex reading, though what a great writer. And Eamon really gets to the heart of what each of these subjects is about, breaks it down beautifully. These books are an education, and it is a miracle that they are free. So, we are going to give the links down below. I just want everyone who's ever followed me over the years, who's found something to agree with in the things that I've spoken about, or who just want to know more about the world, find another frame, to please read all of these books. I'll link a bunch of them.
Yeah.
So, Ajay, what's your recommendation for this week?
For this week, I don't have a recommendation. I have an anti-recommendation for something you should not do. I have a strong claim about something that you should not do and that everybody should not do. Okay. And that is hydroponics. Okay. So there is this whole little cult around growing leaves and vegetables in water with the nutrients, and that's called hydroponics. And it's superficially attractive because the vegetables that are grown through hydroponics are very clean. So it doesn't come from the mess of the soil. There are no insects and worms in that. You don't have to fight as hard to wash them. And that is superficially attractive. But I want to go one deeper and talk about why this is a really bad idea. The insight in this field lies in something that is called the root microbiome. Okay, so just like we have a gut microbiome in the human intestines, there is 1 to 2 kilograms of bacteria and yeasts who process our food for us, so to speak, and create all kinds of complex chemicals that are then used by the human body. In similar fashion, there is a rich, complex construct that is called the root microbiome, which is there in the root system of a plant that grows in the soil. And the root microbiome constructs many, many complex chemicals that are used by the plant. And when plants grow in soil with access to a healthy root microbiome, they have the full range of the nutritional qualities that we expect from a plant. If you kill the root microbiome, either by using chemical fertilizers or pesticides or excessively plowing the soil and so on, or by growing the plant in water, then the root microbiome is not there or it is impaired. And then the collection of nutrients that are present in the plant are systematically inferior. So we should look beyond the superficial happiness that we get out of having a pristine leaf that is so well structured and so clean, because its nutritional quality is actually deficient. And we should always favor the mess of true soil that has not been plowed and that has not faced chemical fertilizers and that has not faced pesticides.
Was illuminating to me, but let me tell you something. Anybody who's eating a leaf, it's a superficial joy only. What joy can you, no matter how it is grown. But leaving that aside, again, a tangential thought we can perhaps end the episode on. What do you think of artificial meat? Because, once when I was 20 years younger than I am today, I turned vegetarian for a year because I was like, just out of compassion, because I felt that, hey, it's, and then there's a story I want to tell you about this, which is about Leo Tolstoy. So Leo Tolstoy in the last years of his life was an incredibly self-righteous, virtue-signaling old man who would lecture everyone, don't do this, don't do that, peace and love, blah, blah, blah. And one of the things he really cared about was, don't eat animals, right? So one day his aunt, and because Tolstoy was old, I'm guessing his aunt was even older, his aunt wanted to come to dinner. But she said, Leo, do not give me any of, your crap about vegetarians. I'm coming to dinner. I want chicken. Right. So Leo said, fine, you come, we'll give you chicken. So the aunt lands up there. And when she lands up there, she's taken to the dining table. And there on her chair is a live chicken, which is going squawk, squawk, squawk. And Leo says, you wanted a chicken? There's your chicken, have it. And to me, and I wrote an essay about this, so it's no longer online anywhere because it was in the late 90s or whatever. And to me, it's a difference that we ignore. It's a seen and the unseen, the chicken on the chair and the chicken on the plate. So, under the influence of these noble thoughts, I thought, let me turn vegetarian. I turned vegetarian for a year, didn't quite manage to grok it. But in modern times, it might be the case that we can have our meat and eat it too, whatever that might mean, in the sense that you can actually grow meat in a lab, like not meat substitutes. You can actually grow, let's say, a chicken leg in a lamb, chicken leg in a lab, not in a lamb. Don't try that at home. You can grow chicken leg in a lab, or even, make a steak in a lab. without the animal ever existing, and therefore that kind of makes it ethical and whatever.
So me too. I'm very excited about those prospects for exactly the reasons you alluded to. It would be so nice to be able to eat meat without harming any sentient creature. And just in case you had any claims around sentience, I want to tell you one last story. I think we are overrunning the time of this episode, but there were recent scientific experiments where the lowest creature you can think of, a fruit fly, fruit flies were exposed to the sight of dead fruit flies. Okay, that's all. So think of it as an intellectual and the moral injury of seeing a dead fruit fly being seen by a fruit fly. And this had an adverse impact on their lifespan. So the mind goes all the way down to flies.
So you mean fruit flies that saw dead fruit flies
had a shorter lifespan.
Had shorter lifespans than fruit flies which didn't see dead fruit flies.
So, we are human. We think that, of course, there is a moral injury involved in seeing a person who has died, or imagine being on a battlefield where many people have died. It's not just us. It is other mammals, it is birds, and it is all the way down to fruit flies. So I think that if we were given a better opportunity to respect all life and have artificial meat, I think that would be a delight.
I think that's a great note to end the show on. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and like. I forgot to say it in the previous episodes, but if you're a YouTuber, you're supposed to say that. So subscribe and like. I apologize for what my producer tells me is a resting pout face and something must be done about it. So I hope you like my charming smile now. And we'll see you next week. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so same thing Amit, you can thoda sa bring the shirt together.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I don't know what you want. So
No,
yeah.
then like
too much. Okay, yeah. Anil Kapoor feels were happening, I guess.
Maybe you can address that also. It's a funny thing.
Yeah.
No, not.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, whatever. Yeah,
Continue. So, before we begin chapter 2, my producer just told me do something about your cleavage. So I've kind of bought my shirt together, but what to do? I guess it's distracting.